Hello, and welcome to the first in a planned series of PowerPoint presentations on topics suggested by the Seer's explanation. The Seer's explanation is a framework or method for dealing with fundamental but hard to answer questions like, what is a human being? Now that's a pretty fundamental question, and it's one that's hardly ever asked. This presentation looks at one particular aspect of being a human being called common sense, and it calls into question something that is virtually never examined. Presenting What's the Matter with Common Sense? A Seer's Explanation Inquiry. In this inquiry, we will take a look at what everybody knows to be so. Sometimes that's called conventional wisdom or the current paradigm. We'll use the term common sense for short. Here are two ordinary guys. We'll call them Manny and Frank. They're regular guys who have done well for themselves. They have a common sense approach to life. What's the matter with that? Well, common sense is very useful in everyday life. As we shall see, it's also a powerful limiting factor in realizing our dreams. But what is common sense? Why do we have it? And how do we use it? To begin with, what do we mean by common sense? Common sense is a basic ability to perceive, understand, and judge things that are shared by or common to nearly all people and can reasonably be expected of nearly all people without the need for debate. So as we go about our daily lives, common sense is that which requires no debate. So let's examine the roles common sense plays in our lives. First, common sense guides our thoughts. Sometimes we use common sense as a basis to examine a new idea. If the new idea fits with what we already know, we accept it easily. If it doesn't, we regard it with suspicion or dismiss it outright. So common sense acts like a filter or like a box that constrains our thoughts. How about an example? Well, most of us believe that the good things in life are in short supply. Since anything that exists as a real, tangible thing is finite, there's only so much of it to go around. It's limited. It's scarce. So for the sake of argument, let's think of scarcity as a thought container. The idea that you, for example, have unlimited purchasing power doesn't fit in that container, so you reject it immediately. The idea that you deserve to have whatever you want doesn't fit in there either. In this example, we could be talking about money, or the availability of potential mates or lovers, or any other resource you consider important. Common sense says they're all scarce. Now, if we all know that scarcity is real, then scarcity acts like a filter. Thoughts that fit with the idea of scarcity are accepted without question. Thoughts that don't fit are rejected immediately, and that's just common sense. So common sense could be described as containing and constraining the possibilities we think are real for us. No possibility outside the common sense container is real for us. Here's another aspect of common sense. It comes from the dictionary. Common sense means good judgment in practical matters. Common sense is useful when you need to get out of a strange room, a typical practical matter. Your brain has seen that door shape before, and it remembers both its function and that of the door handle. So we see that common sense guides our thoughts and that it can be very useful. But of course, what we all know encompasses much more than practical matters. There's also a huge bunch of ideas about life, about ourselves, and about each other. In addition to scarcity, we could examine, for example, inevitability, as in illness and aging are inevitable. It's that larger, more general application of common sense that we're looking at here. Now, there's an interesting aspect to common sense as it pertains to these larger questions. Common sense changes over time. As an example, in Mesopotamian cosmology, about 3500 BC, the Earth was commonly thought to be a flat disk floating in the sea. And people believed that the horizon was an edge, or more functionally, a boundary. At that time, common sense would have told us how to avoid this. It would have said, don't sail out beyond the horizon, whatever you do. That's just common sense. It's pretty easy to see how this belief in the flatness of the Earth limited early explorers and traders. But then the idea of a round Earth appeared in Greek philosophy with Pythagoras around 400 BC, and Aristotle performed calculations that clearly showed the spherical shape of the Earth by about 330 BC. From then on, knowledge of the spherical Earth gradually began to spread beyond the Greek world. Of course, the Flat Earth Society continues to this day to speak of a conspiracy against Flat Earth. Anyway, this was a profound shift. Adopting the idea of the Earth as a sphere allowed people to contemplate sailing away from land safely, and ultimately allowed the discovery of new continents. As a second example, there was a time when people believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. This certainly made sense, since one could observe the sun, moon, and stars traveling across the sky and disappearing in the west. Everything in the night sky was thought of as embedded in its own independently rotating shell. But there was a problem with this picture: retrograde motion. Though the outer planets clearly travel across the sky, they are observed to reverse direction for periods of time, and this seems to conflict with that spherical shell model. When you try to explain retrograde motion with celestial shells surrounding the Earth, you have to add some way to allow the planet to double back on itself. So, Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD used epicycles to explain the retrograde motion of Jupiter. But this made things really complicated. What mechanism could possibly cause a planet to follow those paths? Finally, in the late 1500s, Galileo looked through his telescope at Jupiter's moons and had a powerful insight. The Earth isn't the center of the solar system. The sun is. And thinking of the sun at the center of things solved the problem of retrograde motion much more simply. Pretty cool, huh? Except now the Catholic Church had a problem. Having the Earth not at the center of things appeared to conflict with core church dogma. The Inquisition found Galileo, quote, vehemently suspect of heresy, unquote, in 1615, and he spent the rest of his life under house arrest. He got off easy, as Giordano Bruno had been previously tried for his similar heresies and was burned at the stake in 1600. Well, the church finally got over it about 150 years later. And in 1758, the general prohibition against works advocating heliocentrism was dropped. Now, what lessons about common sense can we draw from these examples? Well, first off, whatever is thought of as common sense in any particular era usually turns out to be wrong, or at least incomplete, no matter how passionately we defend it. Then, when science has come up with a better, more complete explanation, we find ourselves freed by the constraints that were imposed by that earlier one. New possibilities reveal themselves, possibilities that couldn't be seen as real under the old view. Now, if you look at how we acquire it, you can see that common sense is perpetuated as a story about the world that we tell ourselves and our children, often long after science has come up with better explanations for that which we observe. Is this inevitable? Does common sense always lag behind scientific understanding? Well, stories make us feel safe, and we don't want to let go until we can latch onto another one, which might not be ready yet. Okay, but what does this have to do with us? Our shared common sense view of the world agrees with science, right? Well, let's find out. We certainly know how objects behave when we can see or feel them, and a fellow named Isaac Newton worked out the technical description of how they behave over 300 years ago. But early in the 20th century, when scientists began to study how very small things like atoms behaved, it was found that those descriptions don't work very well at all. And when those discoveries were made, they felt, and still feel, very non-intuitive to those scientists. In fact, common sense fails completely when it tries to make sense of these phenomena. So it appears that even now, common sense has not kept up with science. We don't ordinarily notice that, do we? Why not? Here's the situation. We don't see our world view. We just see our world through it. The fish doesn't know about water because water is all it has ever known. And we don't know about the assumptions underlying our common sense view of the world because our common sense view of the world is all we've ever known. And we'll come back to this in a bit. First, let's see if we can find out what assumptions underlie our worldview. If you ask a scientist what our world consists of, she will probably answer with things like matter and energy and somewhat more abstract things like space-time. But how about if you ask a child? He will probably answer with a list of simple objects, each of which has a name. Now, how do you suppose he came by that list? He compiled it as he was taught language. We all teach our kids language when they're very young, and as we do so, we pass along a description of the world or a story about the world, along with the language in which it's expressed. As we grow, that story becomes more and more complex. And gradually, a very interesting thing happens. Our story becomes everything to us. It becomes our world. Now, what would common sense say about the world as a story? Well, common sense would tell you that the world is pretty much what it appears to be. It would tell you that your story about the world is simply more or less accurate, depending on your intelligence, your education, and perhaps your background. It would find laughable the idea that your world is just a story. Common sense would tell you that you should be focusing your attention instead on success and winning at the game of life. You know, like if you're trying to get more of the good stuff and avoid the bad stuff, you need a strategy, common sense, or good judgment in practical matters. See, our story, common sense, determines what we're able to think. All our thoughts must fit inside that boundary, and our strategies for living must conform to those thoughts. So we're saying that our story has become our world. That's how it limits our world. But what about the real world? The one that everyone knows has to be out there beyond the story. That depends on what we mean when we say real. When Niels Bohr and his colleagues followed the experimental evidence, they found that any physical system exists simultaneously in all possible configurations, each with a specific probability of actually showing up. It's only when that system is actually observed that it appears in only one of those possible states. Albert Einstein couldn't accept that notion of the real world. When confronted by quantum physics and its conclusion that an observer is required to create a real world from a field of probable ones, he resisted, insisting that God does not play dice. And by the way, though he is credited with some of the most profound discoveries of the last century, that belief kept Einstein from fully developing quantum theory. Here's the problem. We live inside of our story. It's a story about the objects we encounter and the events we witness. It's a story about what those objects and events mean, whether they're good or bad, and whether we like them or not. It's also a story about why things happen, known as cause and effect. It's an interpretation of reality, and it's not reality itself. We never experience the real or quantum world directly. What we experience is our story about the world, our interpretation of the information provided to us by our senses. All we really know about is how the world behaves when we interact with it, how it appears when we look at it, how it sounds when we listen to it, the way it feels to the touch, and so on. We know what we know about the world in order to maximize our chances for successful lives, in order to survive, and of course to procreate. Once again, we're saying that our worldview is a story, acquired and developed as we learned language. That's all we have. We've mistaken our worldview for the world, and that's just not common sense. But is it supported by science? A while back, we said that common sense doesn't keep up with science. 20th century physics showed us that our ideas about the world are only valid in a narrow human frame of reference. Among the aspects of what we all know that aren't supported by science are our ideas about space, time, matter, gravity, cause and effect. In other words, pretty much everything. How do we make sense of that? To get at that question, let's go back to our metaphorical fish. You could say that there's a hidden assumption underlying her worldview. Water is all there is, which a scientist fish would disprove by getting caught and reeled in. Well, there is one basic assumption that underlies our entire worldview. You know, in Shakespeare's As You Like It, Jacques says, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. He's saying that the world is the persistent background, and that we are transient players in the foreground. He's saying that we creatures come and go, and the world remains. But quantum physics has known for over 100 years that reality exists only as a field of possibilities until we settle on one possibility and make it real. What if that's what it is to be a human being? What if a human being is that which brings one of many possible worlds into actuality? What if the persistent background is simply consciousness? And what we are is consciousness being and acting in the world. If that's the case, we have to exchange the foreground for the background and acknowledge that we are the stage on which life plays out. We are the source of our own reality. All else is temporary. Remember Manny and Frank, our two regular guys? They have a common sense approach to life. They've done well for themselves, and very likely they will leave this earth without realizing who they really are. Imagine how much more satisfied they would feel if they knew by direct experience that they are the creators of their own reality, and that there is no scarcity of anything, anywhere. For For more information and to read the Seer's Explanation blog, please go to www.theseersexplanation.com. That world out there is not what you think it is.